All right, so we are starting a new series based on identifying whether projects are character driven or plot driven stories and what that means. Um, so let's start with character driven stories. So it's no secret that if you follow me on anything, um, that I think that the better way of storytelling is by writing character driven stories. They feel more natural, they feel more organic, and the story never really has to be forced, as long as you follow your characters where they are supposed to go. So, first of all, what makes a story character driven? Character driven stories follow the character's choices, and that develops the plot. Their growth and relationships are what drive the narrative, and there aren't specific plot points that need to happen. And the story is entirely based on our main character and how they interact with the world around them. Um, this often leads, uh, in a television format, to each season feeling slightly different tonally, because it's following the main character's growth. We're going to talk about shows that do this really well, and I promise I will try and find ones that do it poorly, but I try not to rewatch bad TV. But if you have suggestions, please leave them for me. But that's why shows that could be considered narratively questionable with more ridiculous storylines are great character driven stories like One Tree Hill and Gossip Girl. Um, Now, it's not just up to the main character. Often with television shows, we have what's called ensemble casts, which means we're following the stories and the lives of several people. Um, all of their choices are important, though the ones that could be considered more side characters are the ones where their choices aren't going to have as big of a lasting effect on the other characters um, or on the worlds around them. It's a little harder with films because you don't have as much time to explore a ton of characters. However, you can have an ensemble or buddy film that are character driven. Think Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants or Thelma and Louise. There are far more rare though though those are far more rare than ensemble television shows. Now, a plot driven story is much harder to do well. It often leads to underdeveloped characters that have to betray themselves, their personalities, and all of their characteristics to make the plot work. Now, there are shows that do this well, and normally they're what we call monster of the week shows, so that there is an overarching plot for the season, and each episode has its own mini plot or monster. Because shows like Smallville, Supernatural, Buffy the Vampire Slayer used this format. They still focus a lot on character development, but it becomes a bonus part of the story as opposed to a driving factor. That also came from networks forcing shows to be 22 episode seasons. With streaming, you see that format shift quite a little bit because they don't have to do all those filler episodes anymore. So you can have arguably a better plot driven story without having, I'm not going to say as much character development, but without having I would say dead time for character development. Like, character development in those shows was a thing that happened through the plot, not necessarily something that drove the plot. I would argue that Stranger Things is actually a plot driven story, not necessarily a character driven one. Despite that there are a lot of character driven techniques in that story. I think especially in season 2, 3, like past the pilot season, that it becomes more of a plot driven story. I digress. We'll get there. A plot driven story also gives us way less insight into our characters and what they're feeling. We don't really get to see how the plot and things around happening to them are affecting them in any way. It also very much feels like the plot is happening to them instead of with them. Now, like I said, you can do this well. It's just more rare. Lord of the Rings is a plot-driven story, unequivocally a plot-driven story. But it's also one of the greatest pieces of media ever written, watched. It's one of the greatest pieces of media, period, no matter what format you absorb it in. But more often than not, these stories don't have as much connection or as much heart and relatability as character-driven stories. Now, plot-driven stories are far more common when we're discussing film because of the set amount of time. And TV shows are better for character-driven stories because of the longevity allowed. Now, when we start talking about this, we're going to have to start talking about how streaming has affected that balance a little bit, because it's important to consider format as well as structure. So I'm going to rewatch some of my favorite shows and analyze what kind of story they are and why, and hopefully make a pretty solid argument for why character-driven stories are better. So if you have any show suggestions for me, leave me a comment and let me know.